Good afternoon. I have a gavel. Poor Hiniker. Good afternoon. This is the Committee of the Whole, the Metropolitan Council. Charlie Zelli, Chair, and good to see everybody. I was here 5 minutes ago thinking I was going to be just a little early, and 2 people were here, and now it's 4 o'clock. Everybody's here, just on time. We have 2 presentations today, so it's really going to be something I've been looking forward to. And for those that are relatively new, this will be really instructive. And for those of us who've been here for a few years, are always really interested in kind of particularly both population, but also the TPP process is moving forward. But we have the agenda, which those 2 items, and unless there's any disagreement, I will assume the agenda is approved. But we do have minutes from our Committee of the Whole meeting on March 15th. So if there is any corrections or comments on those minutes, otherwise I would entertain a motion and a second for approving the minutes.
So moved. Second.
Thank you. Thank you. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, the minutes have been approved. Todd Graham, our population expert, is first up to talk about growth as we consider the 2050 forecast. Take it away, Todd.
Can you all see this presentation?
Almost.
Let's see.
Oh, here it's on.
Here, it's on. It's on.
Oh,
There it is.
right.
Greg's doing the
Terrific.
thing.
Thank you, Chair Zelli. I'm Todd Graham. I'm Principal Forecaster with Met Council Research. I and our research team prepare and maintain the Council's long-term, long-range economic and population forecasts for the region and for all of the cities and towns and zones in the region. And I'm presenting today an update of the 2050 region level forecast. In our forecasts and planning work, council staff are pushing out the time horizon to 2050. So it's 2050 that we're now talking about. This on screen is an outline of what I've prepared. I know that there are always questions about why did the forecast change, so that's the 4th part of this presentation. And then finally, the 5th part of this presentation will be what comes next, the timeline for preliminary version 2 and version 3 forecasts for all the cities and towns in the region. So, jumping right in, I will start with the front matter, the council's, the forecast's connection to regional planning. Met Council is a planning agency, and any good plan is built on expectations about the future, about conditions related to our planning, and other activities that are going on in the region. So our research team is called on to answer how much growth is expected and ultimately when and where will we see that growth show up. And this work matters because in the Twin Cities region, both Met Council and local governments are involved in systems, infrastructure provision, and services delivery. And we have a concurrency expectation. Regional and local governments are planning for the same future. So that really is the path to planning success that our agency, the counties, local governments, other layers of government are all working with the same future in mind. So how do we know about the future? At Monday afternoon's CDC, Councilmember Lilligren was remarking, and I think I'm paraphrasing, that it's tough to answer questions about the future because it hasn't happened yet. That's almost a Yogi Berraism.
Right. In the past isn't as good of a guide as it was once.
So I'll say that in our planning-related departments at Met Council, our main window for perceiving the future is the use of quantitative models of the regional economy and regional growth dynamics. And there's considerable understanding of these dynamics invested in the models that we use. And so that's what we have to go on, since the future hasn't happened yet. So in this presentation, I'm going to be covering how much growth for the region now to 2050. This presentation will not drill into the stuff that's on, not much into the stuff that's on the right side of this slide, where we expect the growth to happen. We are still in the midst of preparing a separate model that we use for that allocation of where exactly growth is expected. That second model receives the regional totals, the macro level information, and then it locates the future growth to specific cities, townships, neighborhoods, zones. So it's our practice to, I was being gavelled to It's our practice to do this major update of local forecasts in parallel with the regional plan that the council is now getting into. We're at the start of that cycle. So I'm going to talk about the timeline for forecasts in the let's say the final quarter of this presentation. For now, though, let's think about the macro level picture. We have at Met Council a regional economic and demographic model from a vendor called Regional Economic Models Incorporated, or REMI. And this model uses a large set of equilibrium solution for projecting forward macroeconomic accounts and outcomes. And the model is it's an economic model. It's working to represent our economy as a system of economic dependencies and checks and balances. Right. Second thing to say here is there's an economic geography aspect to this. The Twin Cities economy very much grows or declines with the national economic cycle. But also, our region performs semi-independently. It has its own sectors of strength, its own regional economic performance. So it has often been the case that things are a little different for the region than for the nation. One more thing to say of the approach that's outlined on this slide. It's an integrated, simultaneous modeling of the regional economy, employment, workforce supply and demand, migration flows, and population. All of those things falling under this umbrella, this one regional economic and demographic model. And this is absolutely an economic demography best practice. You would want to be forecasting these things together so that they tell a cohesive, coordinated story. If you were to do the population and employment forecasts separately, you might end up with different stories. And we're trying to sidestep that risk, again, with a model that does all of this. So, the big reveal. Here is the updated regional forecast for 2050. We forecast employment growth of 342,000 between now and 2050. That's the first row of this table. And we forecast population growth of 657,000 population between the most recent census and 2050. You'll see on this slide, because year 2020 was such a mess, I have inserted a time point for year 2022 in the table. Otherwise, the numbers are your usual decadal time points. The numbers on the screen do show less growth. Less growth expectations are pulled back from what I've presented in past biennial updates. This is a smaller forecast that I've brought to you. And the story for this decade and the next decade is that we have a new normal. Well, it's a new, uneasy, unstable normal is what it is. We're living through a reset of the regional economy, and that's a fact for metros across the country. The whole country has been through these past 3 years. We're not alone in that. So during this decade, the 20s, and the next decade, the 30s, we will be seeing lower growth rates than maybe we were historically accustomed to. I'm going to address that. I'm also going to talk about migration trends, racial diversity, aging of the population. All of these things are going to upend activity patterns that we were used to. They're going to have implications for the housing market and the job market. But I'm going to start with the economy and employment. You'll remember our region lost jobs during the Great Recession of 2008. And that was the biggest job loss we faced up to that point. We did recover all those jobs. During the Dayton and Walz administrations, the Twin Cities Metro gained over 200,000 jobs between 2010 and 2019. But you see there's this V-shaped divot in the time series. We get to 2020. The Twin Cities region quickly lost all of that employment gain due to the temporary COVID business closures and temporary layoffs in spring of 2020. So this graph does show pretty clearly the low point. But we're now 3 years out from that. We have the official Minnesota deed stats for 2022. We know that most industries, including manufacturing, construction, wholesale trade, transportation, all of those industries have regained all that they lost. They are back at or above their 2019 high point for employment. Not all industries, though. The exceptions are the retail sector, also many services sectors. Those are still a bit depressed and dampened by changes in demand patterns. Hotel industry in the Twin Cities, it's kind of a mess. Activity levels way down from what they were before the pandemic. But I do want to address the shape of this curve. We're about at the point where you see that first blue dot, the end of 2022, and we're approaching a point where the bounce back, the rebound from COVID is wrapping up, and we're reaching a point where workforce participation is eventually going to hit a ceiling. You will hear people say almost everyone who could be working is working. And once we turn that corner, employment growth is forecasted to slow dramatically. 4% growth from 2022 to 30, 4 or 5% per decade growth in employment now and through the year 2040. So that is less than our historical average. If you were to look at the 20 years before the pandemic, you'd see that average growth was over 6%. It was between 6 and 7%, and that was inclusive of a couple recessions that we had. In preparing this forecast, I have compared notes with state economists' office staff independently. They have their own economic models they use. They come up with very similar results. The differences were in the single thousands. The consensus is that both Minnesota and Twin Cities are both at the start of a decade of low growth, low compared to our state and metro's history the past 50 years. So this is going to be a thing that we adjust our minds to, and has big implications for the next thing I'm going to show you, which is population growth. So this on screen, this is a chart of the components that make up population growth. It's a busy chart. Let me give you an orientation to it. The major share of population growth since World War I, this is going way back, has been that green time series labeled natural growth. This is the number of kids being born, less the number of people dying. It's always been a positive number for our region. But you see that we have passed the peak of that natural growth, and it it is decelerating, and now the trends are on the downhill. So on one side of the balance sheet, birth rates are down in this region, in our state, and nationally. Since 2007, birth rates have just steadily declined and have not bounced back. And on the other side of the balance sheet, the number of deaths has been up, most immediately due to COVID. But longer term, the rest of this forecast period, the death rates are going to be rising because the baby boom generation is such a historically large cohort. The purple time series on this chart, which is seems to be the most stable of the bunch, is international immigration. Twin Cities has been an international gateway and destination since about 1980, as refugees began coming here after the Vietnam War and other Indochina wars. And that immigration, it's different people now coming than were coming in the 1980s, but it consistently brings us new population. Twin Cities receives a fairly constant 1% of the national immigration of all new Americans. Okay, now the trouble spot. Finally, the most erratic variable on this chart is the orangish time series, domestic migration between our metro and the rest of the state, the rest of the country. This number can be positive or negative. Are more people coming here, or are more people leaving here? And it's an erratic number because it's a residual number. Every year, about 90 to 100,000 people move to the Twin Cities, and about 90 to 100,000 people leave the Twin Cities. Those are big numbers. The number you see on this chart is the residual difference between those arrivals and those leavers. It's net domestic migration. It doesn't have to be a positive number. All these numbers have the potential to go negative, and the COVID pandemic and all else that's happened in recent years has been we think, a turning point, a point of reset for our metro and also all the other parts of the country. And we are already seeing net domestic migration flip negative. In recent years, population growth has been way down. We believe that this is because of the regional economic reset and because of this domestic migration being so tied and aligned to the economic and employment situation. Anyway, if you add up the data series on this chart, you get the total gray, the gray background quantity that you see on the chart, the total population change. Councilmember.
Yeah, a quick question. Is the trend for this similar statewide, or is that hard to answer at this point?
No, it's not that hard to answer. The trend is similar statewide for the natural growth and the international immigration. The trend is a little bit different for the domestic migration.
And is our domestic migration here in the metro area migrating to greater Minnesota or out of state, or both?
Both. Well, actually, I should put it this way. We're looking at both the number of people who are coming into the Twin Cities and the number of people who are leaving. We think it's the number of arrivals that is down. And I was going to address it later, but I'll address it now. One of the big changes that we think has occurred is that we've lost our historical comparative advantage of being able to draw people here because of the job market. We still have very low unemployment rates, 2.2% according to people across the labor market economists across the street. It's a very low unemployment rate, but it's no longer unique. It turns out we are competing with other metro areas that also have unemployment rates that are less than 3%. And so our unemployment rates don't look that special anymore. Historically, we could draw in job seekers coming from Chicago or Milwaukee. they would realize they had better job prospects here than in Chicago or Milwaukee. But now it's 2023, unemployment rates are low everywhere, and those skilled job seekers in Chicago are saying, hey, I can just stay here and find a job. Why would I leave? That's been a diminishment of our ability to draw people from the rest of the country. So I think in answer to your question, it's on the arrivals side that we're seeing the change.
And one more question about that. Is there any data that indicates whether the decline for beginning in 2021 is related to the murder of George Floyd?
Councilmember Vento, that's a good question. It's not measured in the data sets that I'm using. I think that'd be a good survey question for someone to do, but I
haven't seen that.
I can't off the top of my head think of a survey that asks that of people moving to the region.
Thank you.
There are other surveys that do ask people, why did you move here? But they tend to use response options that are the same all over the country. And it's things like, did you move for employment reasons? Did you move to be closer to family? Did you move for cost reasons? Were you fleeing fire conditions in California? It's things like that. And there's not a question about the civil disruptions of 2020 or the perception of how Minneapolis is perceived. But it's certainly a question that should be asked.
Mr. Chair.
Councilmember Johnson.
Just a quick follow-up on that too. So 2 things. Does this reflect boomers who are now maybe going to Florida or Arizona for 6 months and a day as leaving the state or the region because they come back? And you hear a lot about that with the tax policies and so on and so forth. I won't get into that whole debate, but is that part of the calculation here? They might live here for 5 months out of the year.
Yes, Councilmember Johnson and council members, I think that there is there is this phenomenon you described. I don't know if it makes its way into the population statistics or the surveys that the Census Bureau does, or the estimates that we do for population. I'm not sure. I think it would tend to less affect the population estimates that we prepare every year using our own methodology, because we're mainly looking at what's our housing stock, what of that housing is occupied, and occupancy rates don't necessarily know that someone's gone away for, what were we saying, 6 months and a day? Doesn't necessarily know that.
And Mr. Chair, census data doesn't ask your state of residency?
Yeah, Census Bureau does
Yes.
ask, is this the place that you are living at the time of this survey? Or in the decennial census, they're asking, is this the place you're living on April 1st?
Okay.
So it's a matter of finding people at home.
Okay, because I just, there's people my age, I'm here, I'm not leaving, I love it here. I'll do my thing, pay my taxes and all of it, but, you hear about these, when you have big bubbles like boomers who are all at that age, a lot of them are taking early retirement, which I think is impacting employment as well.
Yes.
And they're deciding to move with their feet. So the other thing is, do we provide the data to Greater MSP, or are they providing their own data when it comes to retaining and attracting talent? Because that is one of their core charges in the region, and they've got robust data. And I know, though, they work closely with the council on all kinds of things. So I know that when I worked there for the 6 years, there was all kinds of stats on who's coming and going and how we're comparing with those peer and competitor regions. So,
Councilmember Johnson, other council members, I know that they use our government stats products, and I have to admit we've been out of touch with them since they had some staff turnover in their research department. I need to find out who their research department is now.
the main research person's now the VP, so she's still there. But I only say that because, you know, there's just they might have some insights too. I'm not doubting this is interesting. I just like to drill down and understand, to your point, what is happening within these bubbles and how are we doing in attracting people of color if you disaggregate the data and all of those things. I know that's a whole nother conversation, but.
Councilmember Cameron?
Yeah, I do want to add that at the state level, I rely on your projections quite a bit, and I'm a real champion for the data that you all present.
Thanks.
I use it quite a bit in my work at the legislature and beyond. So I wanted to ask a specific question about this graph that you showed, and what in the model is forecasting the uptick in domestic migrants beginning in 2040? Is there something that you can point to as to why we're seeing that return?
Well, this is an in-depth question. You want the answer now or later?
Well, it's up to you.
Yeah.
I don't want to
I'll answer
interrupt your
it.
flow.
Yeah,
If you're-
right.
you got in there.
Yeah, I'll answer it now. You know, I started this presentation by referencing Councilmember Lilligren and saying the way that we know the future, our response to it hasn't happened yet is that we're using models. So when I look into the model documentation from REMI.com, they say that there's three economic factors and also a non-economic factor that are most determinant of that domestic migration number. And of those three economic variables, the ones that seem to make the most, have the most leverage in our region, number one is what's going on with the level of total employment, and specifically, I mean, this feels speculative, but in the models that we're using, it shows sort of a manufacturing renaissance in that final decade. And manufacturing is a sector where we have some industry clusters and some nation-leading concentration of talent and market share. And that uptick in manufacturing in the final decade actually pulls up our total employment level and pulls up domestic migration. But that's not the main thing. The main thing of these economic variables is what I was describing as our unemployment rate versus everyone else's unemployment rate. And in the model, there's a variable called regional employment opportunity index, which, as far as I can tell, is a fancy way of looking at the difference between unemployment rates. So there is a divergence that occurs at the end of the 2030s where the national unemployment rates start to trend upward and all of our competing metro areas expecting slightly higher unemployment rates. Our unemployment rate actually remains pretty tight. We might have an advantage similar to the advantage that we lost before the pandemic. So those are the two factors that the model actually is relying on to come up with this projection. Apologies, council members, that was such a long answer.
I have one more question.
Go ahead.
And before, I just want to comment that maybe that 2041 number for the domestic migrants is all those people who moved to Texas and Florida moving home long enough to have their relatives take care of them before they depart. I want to look just for, and if you've already explained this, Todd, I apologize, but the 2001 to 2010 graph where it shows the domestic migrants significantly departing, is that related to 2008, 2009, or what happened there?
Councilmember Vento, that was actually a slow employment growth decade even before the economic recession of 2008.
Okay.
Even before that, employment was very slow during that decade, and it was reflected in the migration of people coming here responding to job market conditions. So, you know, if you were to look at a longer time span, if I were to add even other historical decades, you'd see that the 1980s and 1990s were very strong decades. 2001 through 10, not. So these trends do turn from time to time. And
Mr. Chair, just briefly, in housing, we talked about this, I think, at some point, but are we seeing things like climate refugees, war refugees showing up in these stats with that kind of a outlook?
Councilmember Johnson and council members, the model does not forecast that, but we have, you know, as the forecast modeler, I have inserted some assumptions about what you're calling climate migrants into the model. I'm relying on work done by Matt Hauer at Florida State University, who has done the most, I would say, the most detailed projections of metro to metro migration flows in response to year 2100 sea level rise. And if you're familiar with the climate change science, you know that sea levels are rising, and it's going to mostly affect places like Florida, the Gulf Coast, the coastal areas. There could be something like 10 to 13 million people affected by that. Matt Hauer at Florida State did come up with a metro-to-metro migration grid of what's expected based on how people have responded to, well, past disruptions, which isn't a perfect guide, but you know, these past disruptions would be much smaller things like Hurricane Katrina or the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. So we have those, that work from Hauer. I inserted that to the model, and I also made some, I'm gonna say, guesses about other climate change dimensions beyond just sea level rise, because there's drought and water shortage conditions in the Southwest. There's rising temperatures and heat stress. There are these other, and there's agricultural stress and decline. All of these things should have impacts in the way of climate change, but the actual numbers aren't that big. This is a long way of getting to the finish line here. The numbers that I get from the Hauer work are not that big. It's on the order of about 1,500 people total in this decade, 2,500 people in the next decade, maybe 3,500 people in the 2040s to 50 decade. And those numbers are not very big when you're comparing it with the total gain of 70,000 people in that final decade. So it turns out that we're pretty far from the coasts. There will be climate-related migration. There's not a past precedent of it coming here. So our regional share of that 10 to 13 million people displaced is something like, it's less than 0.2%. It's not a big share. And Hauer explains this as people might be climate refugees and their house got flooded and floated out to sea, but they still want to be in the southeast or within 200 miles of where they are. So Atlanta ends up being a big gainer, but we do not.
Probably heard how we celebrated.
I'm gonna skip on to the next slide. If you were to take all those components of growth and add them together, this is the population time series that adds up the population for the next 30 years. You do see that growth rate does decline to about 6% per decade, this decade and the next, and that's historically low compared to the double-digit gains that we had in the 1980s, the 1990s, and the 2010s. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to be quick about trends that you're familiar with. The racial and ethnic diversification of the region is a steady long-term trend. Populations of Blacks, Latinos, Asians, other races are all growing. Meanwhile, the white population, which is the beige-colored time series on here, is not growing beyond this decade. It levels off. That is not a segment of the population that's growing. Let's drill down into specific groups. Almost all of these groups on screen Blacks, Asians, Hispanics, Latinos, almost all of these are almost doubling between 2020 and 2015. And the reasons for this, one is birth rates, two is death rates. Most of the people dying in this region are still white people, because there's an age mix distribution difference between the white population and populations of color. And then finally, I think the biggest thing is the migration that we were talking about. The people moving to the Twin Cities look like the rest of the nation. The people who are leaving the Twin Cities look like the Twin Cities metro of year 2000. It is that churn that lends to the rapid diversification of the region's population. Aging of the population. Sooner or later, most of us are going to find ourselves senior citizens, and we are gaining seniors rapidly. That's the green time series that you see on this slide. This is historically new, because the baby boom generation born in the 1940s, 50s, early 60s was the largest generation up to that point, and the first generation really to enjoy the longer life expectancies that came out of medical and health revolutions in the 20th century. So, hey, good news, we're living longer than we were in 1930. And you're seeing that ballooning of the senior population now. That's going to have implications for activity patterns and transportation usage, the housing market, workforce trends. I'm not going to get into all of those today, but it's certainly material for a future discussion, how all of those are affected by demographic shifts. The next chunk of this presentation is, well, I may have answered some of this about how and why our regional forecasts have changed since the Thrive 2040 plan's adoption, and also since the last time that I came and gave this presentation before you all. You've probably seen this slide before. I think I used it 2 years ago and 4 years ago. I usually say, well, forecasts can change because something in our model changed or the data inputs to the model changed. That's not the story this year. The story is that final bullet point on here. It's actually the world that we live in has changed quite dramatically. We're pulling back our expectations based on what we've learned the last 3 years and also the data that we now have. So some of the things that that you see for the first time in this forecast update, death rates were up because of COVID. Birth rates have been falling. Well, I say on here in 2020, birth rates have been falling since about 2007, but they reached the point of being historically very low in 2019, 2020, and 2021. We're in uncharted territory now with how low the birth rates are. Third and fourth thing that I've discussed is reshaped economic competitiveness. We're dealing with some new things with respect to our competitiveness competing with other metro areas and how that affects migration rates. So these next couple slides are some line graphs comparing in green the forecast that I'm bringing you today, and then in yellow and blue is the forecasts that we presented the council with in 2015 and 2019. Yeah, we have clawed back these numbers. If you look at the 2040 time point, because that's how far our forecast went in 2019. At that time in 2015 and 19, we were expecting about 800,000 population gain over a 30-year period. Now that number is we've trimmed off about 100,000. The 2010 through 40 gain is 705,000 people. That's a 3% difference to the year 2040. That's going to be noticeable. It is going to cut into housing demand, it is going to cut into workforce supply availability. That 3% difference on population is nothing when you start looking at the employment numbers. We discussed already that there was a population, there was an employment, sudden employment loss in 2020. You see that starkly on this chart, where we had been expecting almost 500,000 jobs over 30 years. Now we only expect 354,000 jobs during the 2010 through 2040 period. So we've shaved about, we've trimmed or hacked about 6% of employment off of the future expectations. That's a big change as well. I've got this slide for describing to you what I think is going on. Some of this I think I've already addressed in response to Councilmember Cameron's question. In past iterations of this regional forecast, we had this virtuous cycle of migration, workforce, and jobs all growing together, and Twin Cities having really good conditions for economic growth and low unemployment and good wages would draw in people from the rest of the country. Since 2020, 2/3 of that relationship, the grayed out slices of the pie have kind of stalled. We no longer have this clear advantage over the rest of the country in employment opportunity. People can again stay in Chicago and find the jobs that they want in their specialty. And so migration and workforce and employment growth all stalling out pretty much together. We think that is going to be the case the rest of this decade, and perhaps 15 years from now as well.
Can I ask
Angela, sorry, I was not paying attention.
I'm not sure if you can directly address this question depending on what you looked at in terms of comparative metros, but what are our competing metropolitan areas? Is it geographically some of the locations you mentioned, the Milwaukee area, the Chicago area, those areas that are closest to us, or is it broader, similarly population-sized metro areas?
Yes, Councilmember Cameron, I different ways of answering this. I think we have often looked at the 24 metro areas that have over 2 million population. We've also often looked at just the 12 metro areas that Greater MSP identifies as competitors for business and talent and site selection. Those would be mostly comparably sized. And when I named Chicago and Milwaukee earlier, when we look at the migration patterns of population, it has historically been, there's been a gravitational field effect where we do better with drawing people from the rest of the Midwest than we do drawing people from let's say, Florida. So proximity is something, and over the last half century, we've been very successful at depopulating Iowa and the Dakotas. So we've got that, and I think we still attract a lot of population from Chicago.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
do you factor in cost of living too? I know at Greater MSP we track that, of course,
Yes.
because if you're in San Francisco and there are jobs available here and you like water and weather, you can come here and have a better cost of living situation. Has that changed during COVID? Has our cost of living gone up and we're not as competitive? Is that factored into the gray area that you referenced?
Councilmember Johnson and council members, I'm relying on our data, our model and data vendor, Remi.com, to provide me some of that. So some of their data may be about a year old, but up to the point that we got the last data refresh from them, it didn't look to us like our cost of living had been substantially affected. And in fact, the competitiveness of compensation and wages here remained pretty strong, better than the national average. The thing that really changed was those unemployment rates and the attractiveness as of the Twin Cities as a place to move to find employment, because people could again stay in Chicago. And but to your point, Councilmember Johnson, the short answer is yes, we are looking at cost of living differences, and this is one of the things that remains a competitive advantage here.
May I ask the question quickly?
Go ahead.
Typically, jobs, thank you, I'm sorry. Typically, jobs and housing and economic activity and all of that would track together until, of course, now the move toward remote work has so greatly increased. When we count jobs or employment in our area or state, how do we factor in that remote work?
Councilmember Carter and council members, yes, that was a big shift that took place during the pandemic, with at one point something like a quarter of workers being remote workers or telecommuters. We think that number has ebbed a little bit, but it's still a large number. We think it's probably structurally locked in now that remote work ends up being a permanent thing. It might not grow between now and 2040 as much as we saw between 2019 and 2020, but we count employment by the location of the employer, which is a traditional way of doing it, and those are the kind of statistics that we get from Minnesota DEED, the agency that officially tracks employment for the state. And we do with our model try to come up with a share of those jobs that are held by remote workers not living in the Twin Cities metro. And that number did rise, and we think it's going to remain at about where it settled in 2022. We don't think that number is going to, again, rise dramatically, but there is now a couple tens of thousands of people who are remote workers not living in the Twin Cities metro. They could be living anywhere.
And so you use that factor when you're looking at the other drivers or the other things that are driven by that employment number. For example, the economic activity that, or the housing or the, other areas that would be impacted.
Councilmember Carter, yes, we do. We're forecasting workforce supply, population, and the jobs by place of work all simultaneously, and we've made accommodation for this share of the workforce being remote and outside the region.
And can you share that share?
I don't have it with me today, but yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to go into the last piece of this presentation, which is excuse me, which is just giving you a preview of what happens next. The thing that I've presented to you is regional totals, regional trends, regional averages. We take that macro level information and we're passing it to a second modeling stage, what we call a land use model or a local forecast model. If we're going to grow by 657,000 residents and 300,000 households, where will those households be siting themselves, choosing to live? That modeling effort is work that is now underway. We will have a preliminary set of local forecasts ready by this summer. When we have that ready in summer, it's going to be shared with regional planners here in the building who are going to take that set of local results and put it through its paces, inputting it to whatever analyses or models that they have in the Transportation Services Division and Environmental Services, which includes water supply, demand projections. We're going to get feedback from those regional planners, and that will then launch us into version 2 of the local forecasts, which we hope to have ready by mid-2024, in time to publicly release that as what I would call either version 2 or a public hearing version of the local forecasts. There might be a version 3 if you as a council decide that it's necessary to make changes during that public hearing time span. But version 3 will be the final set of local forecasts that are adopted with the regional plan in the last quarter of 2024. So we do have this forecasts cycle that neatly parallels our regional planning cycle. We're doing this forecasting work at the same time that other pieces of the regional plan and system plans are coming together. Oh, and there's the timeline of that. I'm sorry, I was a slide behind. Yes, this will progress over the next year and a half, and we expect to have the first version, the preliminary or version 1 of local forecasts by summer of late summer of 2023. Chair Zelli and council members, if you have other questions, I'm here to answer.
Thanks, Todd. That's really informative, and you could tell we've stopped you with questions along the way. Chai, you know.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Todd. The great work that the research department does is always amazing. And I always really look forward to this particular presentation. My question is about tracking socioeconomic class. One of the reasons my family came to Minnesota, like a lot of Hmong folks from California in the 1990s, was because of economic opportunity. There was a lot of high unemployment in California, and many of us were trying to escape the cycle of poverty and the very penal public welfare state of California. And so as a person who grew up poor, I'm interested in knowing whether we also track economic class of the people in our region, because if we all have jobs, but many of us live under the federal poverty line, then how does that account for domestic migration patterns here to and from here?
Yes, Councilmember Lee, we are outside of this REMI model, splitting apart the households forecast into let's call them income levels: very low income, middle, high income. But it relies on some time series analysis that we're unsure of. The big question is the progress of our region's prosperity something that continues over time? We don't have a good modeling of that in the REMI model, so we're really making assumptions that are, for better or worse, steady state assumptions that the income mix that you see in the Twin Cities today tends to remain the income mix. Having said that, there's a lot of racial diversification happening, and those new Minnesotans or new Twin Cityans, we feel may be coming here as you mentioned, your family coming here for the economic opportunities and enjoying the regional prosperity that we have. So on the whole, people who are coming here, we expect to have potential to better their quality of living over time.
Other questions?
This is excellent.
All right, well, thank you. We know we'll stay tuned as you continue to refine the forecast. Thank you. So now we are shifting to the TPP update. Cole and maybe Amy, are you, no, just Cole, okay, I got it. Cole, we're in good hands.
I asked her, but
Give her the afternoon.
well, good afternoon, council members. I'm Cole Hiniker, manager multimodal planning at MTS, and I'm also the 2050 Transportation Policy Plan project manager for 2050. So I'm here today to talk about a few different topics. For all of you reappointed council members, this is maybe a little bit of a refresher about what the TPP is, but for all you new council members, hopefully a helpful high-level introduction about what the Transportation Policy Plan is. We're also going to talk about our process to update the 2050 TPP. Again, just a couple of highlights about our phases and what we're planning to do. The bulk of our discussion today is about some recent engagement we've done on the 2050 TPP with stakeholders to talk about goals and what we want to accomplish with the transportation system in 2050. So I'm going to breeze through the early sections as much as I can, but feel free to interrupt if you have questions. I'm going to focus primarily on those slides 18 through 31. I did want to just note, one of the points of feedback we got was we don't have enough pictures of the whole spectrum of the region. So does anybody know where this photo is?
Stillwater?
Looks like every community, right? No, I think this one's actually downtown Chaska, or Belle Plaine, one of the two. I have to go back and look. But. All right, so first point to make is what is the Transportation Policy Plan? One of the things that's very distinct about the Transportation Policy Plan from some of the other system plans is it is an investment plan. It has significant dollars in it that direct investment in the region. Both regional systems, like transitways and highways, but also directs all federal funds, transportation funds that the region spends. So any project receiving federal transportation funds has to be consistent with the region's long-range plan, including local projects. Another significant role that you're probably all more familiar with is that we guide local planning. So we guide the direction of transportation systems, making sure that they're consistent with the regional system and making sure that they're consistent with land use assumptions and other system plans that the region has. So those are the two primary roles of the TPP, just as a quick primer there. Another thing that's unique about the TPP is we have federal requirements. Most of the other plans in the system come from state statute requirements, but ours actually primarily flows down from federal requirements. So there's some requirements in the federal law that state that we have to cover all modes except for aviation, which is actually required under state statute. It also requires that we cover at least 20 years of forecasted growth. So this update to the 2050 plan will get us into compliance with that. We don't have to update our plan to be 20, we just have to, every time we update it, we have to make sure we're looking out at least 20 years. Something else that's unique is we have to be fiscally constrained under reasonable financial assumptions. So what that means is we have to forecast out all the revenues that we reasonably can assume to get in the region through 2050. And we can only identify projects that we can afford based on those revenue projections. We can identify a vision beyond what we can afford, but we can't say it is a part of our officially adopted plan. So that's a very important thing. And those reasonable assumptions usually mean trends or laws that we can point to that say we know we're going to get this source of funding because of this. We can't assume we're going to get it based on a proposal or any kind of bill that the legislature is considering.
And this is all sources at federal, local.
Local, federal, state. Just a couple of other small things. We do include federal performance targets. Again, we have to include all regionally significant projects. The one nuance there is that a project could be entirely locally funded, not funded with federal dollars. It still needs to be in our plan if it's regionally significant. And that means if it has potential to impact the regional transportation system. So a new interchange on a freeway system could be funded entirely with local dollars, but because it's regionally significant, it would have to be amended into our plan in order to move forward. We also do a lot of analysis under federal law on air quality and environmental justice. And then we have what we call a congestion management process, which is required for all MPOs nationwide. State requirements are pretty similar. The only nuances to the state are that We do provide guidance to local development, so that is not something required under federal law. And then, as I said, we have a regional aviation system plan requirement under state law. The other thing that's unique in statute is that the statute actually lays out the relationship between the Met Council and TAB, including specifically names the membership of TAB. And the Transportation Advisory Board is part of our MPO process. It's a 34-member board that is advisory to the council on all matters related to the MPO. So a little bit more specifics in terms of what the Transportation Policy Plan covers. As I said, we provide strategic investment direction, and it's primarily directing strategic investments in regional systems. So things like your major roadways, whether it's freeways or principal arterials, minor highways, so a lot of county roads are in that category. We also direct investments in light rail, BRT, all of the transitways have to be acknowledged in our plan. We do direct high-level guidance to transit providers. You know, we don't go out to every provider and say, you need to provide a route here. We say, we would like you to be consistent with regional standards when you're providing the service that's tailored to your community. We also have a regional bicycle transportation network that helps us to direct investments in regional bicycle facilities. And then, of course, we have a Metropolitan Airport's role as well. On that secondary piece about guiding our partners, we do provide strategic direction to some of our partners and some of our other processes. So when we work with, say, MnDOT, they actually, a statewide plan kind of flows downward from state to regional level. It also flows upward. We actually can dictate to the state what we would like to see for regional investments coming from MnDOT. So that's a bit of a back and forth that we have. We also guide investments through our partners in the regional solicitation. The majority of our projects in the regional solicitation are locally implemented projects. So we're not just directing council projects or MnDOT, we're directing city and county and transit provider projects. And then, of course, we guide local governments not just through their comprehensive planning, but through corridor planning as well. Anytime a county or a state is taking on a roadway corridor study, we're at the table talking about how it's consistent with the regional plan.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah.
just a couple of things, Cole, for the new people. What is a regional solicitation plan? And then TAB is Transportation Advisory Board, made up of local officials, and there's a reason for that. But just for the new people who are like, what does that word mean?
Yeah, thank you for asking.
Good catch, thank you.
We tried to figure out how much context should we give without not getting into the rest of the content. So the Transportation Advisory Board is 34 members, as I said. It's actually over half, it's the majority elected officials, county and city, state agency representatives, and then 8 citizen representatives appointed by the Metropolitan Council. I think 4 modal representatives as well. So it's a mix of a lot of different perspectives that meets every month to give us direction on things, as I said, related to the regional transportation planning role. The regional solicitation is our process for distributing a significant chunk of the federal funds that flow into the region under formulas from the federal government. So we generally spend or allocate, depending on pre-IIJ, about $200 million, and sorry, I'm using another acronym, pre-new federal transportation infrastructure bill, about $200 million every 2 years. Now it's closer to $250 million every 2 years. So it's a significant chunk of money, and we distribute that through a variety of programs, of which TAB primarily facilitates that process. Met Council ultimately approves the list of projects that are selected out of that process. As I said, mostly local projects, city and county projects. But adequate.
Just making sure, because I had a lot of stuff thrown at me at first and I had to go back and look it up, so I figured we'll just get it out on the table while we're here, so.
This is just a quick note, reminder for those reappointed council members that we do have specific transportation policy plan goals. And these are the 2040 goals. There's 6 of them. I'm not going to read them, just as a kind of quick reminder here. The reason I bring this up is because our engagement on the TPP to date has primarily been about what should our new goals be. And we talked a lot about, are these still the goals? Do we want to kind of create some new ones? And of course, there's other inputs we're going to be considering there. But these were the 2040 TPP goals that we established back in 2014 when the plan was first adopted. And then just another note, these are the general chapter topics we have in the 2040 TPP, just to give you a sense of the other things we talk about. The only thing really unique here that I wanted to point out was that we do have a section called the work program. This is often where we talk about things we don't know enough about when we adopt the plan, but we're going to continue to research. So it's in some ways some of a research plan or an investment studies plan. The rest of these are topical areas that we just dive into more detail on each of them to give our partners some context and direction. So moving on to the 2050 TPP and how we're planning to develop that. This is going to be some very high level stuff, so feel free to chime in if you have questions. The planning cycle that we generally go through is we adopt the 2040 TPP, and as I said, we have a work program. Between the every 5 years that we update the TPP, that's required under federal law, we do a lot of analysis and studies to try to inform how we can better reflect the region's needs and values. So oftentimes our studies are informing things like, where do we need to invest better? Where are investment priorities in a particular area? What are some of the performance outcomes we want to see as a region, and how can we better understand those moving forward? And then also, what are some new policies and actions that we think the region could benefit from as we're making strategic investment decisions? So we've been conducting studies over the last 5 to 10 years to try to better prepare ourselves to produce the best 2050 plan that we can. Just a couple of examples, we did a highway mobility hub planning guide. If you don't know what a mobility hub is, I'm not going to get into it today. Just know that we did that to help the region better understand what a mobility hub is. We did a highway mobility needs study. And then a couple of ongoing studies we have. We have a regional safety action plan. You'll see why that's important as I get into the themes later on. We've been looking at travel demand management, recognizing that COVID was probably the biggest travel demand management test this country's ever done, and that we might want to learn about some things that we can learn about that time. An equity evaluation of our transportation investments to try to better understand how we can incorporate equity in our decision-making process. And then another topic I know it's important to council, looking at how we can better measure the impacts of climate change when we're making investments in transportation. So all of those are gearing up to be completed to inform the 2050 TPP, among others. Those are just examples. In terms of the process and the timeline, just a couple of highlights here. We're really in that middle phase of having gone through some visioning at the regional level. A lot of that was done in the previous 6 months, perhaps under the other council members, but I know that there have been updates at this group about that regional vision. We're engaging on the TPP on goals and objectives. At the same time, we're looking at new policies that we should be exploring to help deliver goals and objectives. You can imagine that's a bit of a concurrent process, and you need to know where you want to be before you can identify the policies to get there. So we're really starting with what do we know we want to do now, and then we'll revisit what do we need to do more of based on the refined goals and objectives. After we get all that in place, we start writing chapters. You can see we had a lot of chapters. The TPP, I'm just going to throw a number out here with something like 600 pages if you add up all the chapters. It's a very robust document. Part of that's because we have a lot of analysis in there. Part of it, as I said, is because we're directing some very specific project dollars, billions of dollars over the life of the plan. We will then have a public comment process starting in the spring of next year, and then refinement and final adoption targeted for November of 2024. So this fall is when our staff are going to be hunkered down, writing a lot of the content for the 2050 TPP. Just to give you a sense for how we're engaging with some of our partners on a regular basis, we do have working groups that are specific to the TPP. As I said, there is the Transportation Advisory Board and the Met Council relationship. We have a TPP advisory work group that informs both TAB and the Metropolitan Council. That is policymakers from around the region that meets every month. It's a mix of council members. I know that we're looking for some new appointments to that because we lost 2 members. I'm assuming that's coming soon. We also have technical working groups, both under TAB. There's the planning and programming technical working groups, and then there's even more detailed technical working groups specific to the TPP. It's a pretty big group. I want to say it's like 40 members of staff from agencies and different variety of stakeholder groups across the region. And so those two groups are the primary ones talking about the TPP, but we also continually update groups like TAB, groups like you all as the Full Net Council, and some of our other technical committees. And just so you know, the TPP Advisory Work Group, here's the specific membership. You can see the 2 vacant positions under the Metropolitan Council, but this is more of a reference slide for you all to know who's on that Policymaker Advisory Work Group as we move forward. So these are hopefully reminder slides. These are presented at your last committee of the whole, but I wanted to use them just to frame up another concept. As we work on the 2050 planning, this is the unified structure that we're working towards across all the system plans, recognizing that we have vision and values drafted for the region. We're starting to move into the goals, drafting conversation, and that those goals can be both cross-cutting across the region, across all system plans, and also in some places system plan specific. So we do anticipate having specific transportation goals in the 2050 TPP that'll help us both satisfy, as you can see down below, actions that we want us and partners to take, but also the specific investments we hope to make to achieve those goals. So it's really important for us to have that strong framework in place to be able to justify the decisions we make when we invest. If you have a lot to say, and no structure around it, then people start to question, what is your real strategic vision for the region in terms of how you invest? I wanted to put this slide into a little more context too. This was presented at your last committee of the whole, that shows that the regional vision statements on the left there, they really do feed into the 2050 Regional Development Guide, which will be the updated Thrive MSP 2040. Underneath that are all the system plans, and the system plans are really your opportunity to show how the council can help implement the vision and values of the region. So, on the next slide, we try to provide some examples of what this looks like in implementation for the TPP. So this first slide, I picked kind of a softball. Everyone likes safety. Safety is an agreed upon goal. You'll see that later. So this is actually a current goal in the TPP, that the regional transportation system is safe and secure for all users. And these are just examples. They're not meant to be nuanced at this point, but examples of things that we might say are objectives. Those are objectives are more specific ways to measure your goal that give a little bit more direction about what do you intentionally mean by that. So we have 2 potential options here. One is eliminate fatal and serious injury crashes, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Another twist on that idea is another aspect of which that we want all travelers to feel comfortable and welcome using the system. So just 2 potential objectives that we could be saying that are transportation specific. So what does that look like in action? We have policies and actions that are going to be coming out of this framework. And here's 2 example policies that we put together. One is that we prioritize investments that reduce fatal and serious injury crashes. Probably seems pretty obvious, right? If we want to do that, we should say we're going to prioritize that. The other one is that we prioritize investments that improve the comfort of traveling by transit, bike, walk, and rolling. So those could be policies, and then we can start to tie investment decisions to those policies. So the examples on the right primarily build on the first policy. So the action could be that we actually tell TAB and the Metropolitan Council that when we fund projects through our $250 million biannual solicitation, that we are going to prioritize projects that actually do this action, that actually do reduce serious injuries and deaths. Or we could create an entire funding category specifically targeted at this goal. So those are just 2 ways that you can see, we're not just talking about platitudes here, we're talking about how does this goal translate into investment decisions that not just us, but our regional partners make on the system. Another option that we looked at was access to destinations. This is very wordy, but that first goal there is our current goal, just noting that we want to make the system more reliable for users and provide better access to destinations. One of the objectives we currently have is to increase the availability of options, specifically in congested corridors. So a policy example there might be that we try to maximize the performance of the system as measured by person throughput. For those of you who aren't transportation engineers, which I'm guessing is the majority of you, a lot of times historically we look at roadways function by vehicle throughput. How many vehicles can we push through a roadway section? But if you look at person throughput, it balances out the ability of buses and bike lanes and pedestrian pathways to help alleviate that demand on the roadway. So looking at person throughput is actually a more effective way to get at this goal than, say, looking at vehicle throughput. And so if we have that policy in place, then we can say to partners, hey, when you're choosing the best investment in your corridor, you should be looking at person throughput, not vehicle throughput. You can imagine that's not a universally accepted way to do things across all partners in the region. So again, just a couple of examples of how that flows down to implementation. So now to the bulk of the presentation. We are here to talk about what we've been doing to engage with our partners on the 2050 goals for TPP. So we actually hired 2 different consultants to help us out with this work and conduct a number of listening sessions over the last couple of months. We hired TC2, Transportation Collaborative and Consultants. They're a DBE firm with a prime on this contract. They also have support from HDR and HKGI. A lot of great community engagement staff that are working on that project. In addition to that, we have a separate equity consultant, SDK Communications, helping us engage with community groups and other groups that I should say the first team is primarily focused on our government partners. So SDK is focused on those more non-government partners like community groups, corridor coalitions, business agencies, things like that. They're doing a couple of different things as part of this project. They're looking at peer region plans and plans within the region to develop themes. What is everybody already saying in their plans that's important? What are the common themes that we can see? The bulk of their work is engaging with our partners in listening sessions. We've actually conducted, I want to say, 17 listening sessions with government partners over the last 2 months, and the equity engagement consultant have conducted somewhere around 30 additional interviews or listening sessions. So a lot of engagement over the last 2 months. I've been going all over the region. I've been in Andover, or we've been in Andover, we've been in Sherburne County. I'm not going to get into the nuances of why we're in Sherburne County today. You'll learn more about that later. We've been down in Carver, Empire City, which is the newest city in the region, down in Dakota County. We're out in Stillwater for Washington County. So we've been all over the region. We try to meet people where they're at in this project. And ultimately, this consultant's going to summarize a lot of these themes and present us with a final report. We have some initial of those results today that I'm going to go over. This is a quick summary of who the equity engagement consultant was engaging with. Again, different types of groups and a mix of interviews, sometimes 1 or 2 person interviews, sometimes a listening session in which we invited multiple stakeholders. So this just gives you a sense for the types of groups that they were engaging with. Really quick, one slide on what they looked at with existing plans. They looked at a variety of different plans from state to federal to county to council to local government plans. And they tried to identify the different themes that they saw consistently across those topics. The 3 that really stood out to them when they were doing this analysis was everyone says safety is important. I don't think that's a surprise, and that's going to be reiterated when we talk about what we heard in the listening sessions. The other thing that we heard was that multimodal investments are important, and the idea of getting a more attractive, balanced system is important at all levels of government. And then the other one that was highlighted was economic impact. Not as common in the city plans, but it was definitely consistent across county and council and state and federal plans. The idea that transportation plays an important role in the economic vitality of a region. And I'm going to nuance that a little bit when I get into the themes, but just note that that was prevalent in all of those plans. And then just for your reference, there's some of those other topics about how prevalent those were. And we have actually have about a 100-page memo on this topic specifically, if anybody ever wants to see that. So when we were out and about, we'd used a variety of tools. We talked to people. We also used Menti, Mentimeter.com. And so we're having live polling. Sometimes we're doing actual polls. Sometimes we're asking open-ended questions like the ones in the slide here. The primary point was to say both what's important to you from the 2040 TPP, like what's still relevant from what you see our current goals are, but also like what's more relevant now than was back then that we should be incorporating in the 2050 TPP. So pretty broad brush questions that people were able to submit a variety of answers to. And then I'm going to go into the themes, of which I think there's about 9. So first I wanted to start with the fact that the TPP goals and funding need to be more specific and focused. A theme that we heard was that we try to say everything is important, and as a result, we don't really say anything is important. And each of these slides has a couple of quotes or nuances to this. So some of these are direct quotes from our partners, and some of these are just kind of nuances to that point. So, things like we need to be focused. We get watered down when we try to do everything. We don't end up, affecting what our true priorities are. Any project can be fit into the TPP strategies. We actually heard that from a partner. I can justify anything I want based on your plan. The TPP should say more to drive action on regional goals. This is my favorite quote in the entire engagement. Met Council, the words on the page are almost always helpful, but the implementation is always weak. And I think that's something we need to really think about. We can't just say the right things all the time. We have to make sure we're backing it up with our policies and actions. And then the TPP should set goals based on the benefit of the entire region. That doesn't necessarily mean that every individual city or county is going to get their goals and needs met. We need to have shared goals. I have an example here of this in action. This is the current structure of how we evaluate the regional solicitation. We have 13 funding categories, and across that we have about, I want to say 15 evaluation measures. Each of those actually has even more specific metrics that we use to evaluate it. So you can see if you're a member of the public and you say, where is the Met Council really focused on investing? Well, this doesn't create a very clear picture to our partners. And we've heard that from a lot of our partners in this engagement. So the second theme I wanted to talk about was that safety is the most important goal to our government partners. But when we talked to our community partners, there was a different interpretation of what we meant when we say safety, and that there's concerns among our stakeholders about what we're trying to accomplish there. So, from the government partners, you might not be surprised to hear, safety is a core function of transportation. How can we invest if not for a safe system? You can imagine these quotes from the right are more from community partners, that safety is often framed as homeless people sleeping on the trains makes me feel unsafe. But we have to remember that those people also feel unsafe, and it's not just about providing safety for a certain segment of the population. And I think this other one is very unique, and I will just note, a lot of our community discussions on safety were heavily focused on transit. Our partners don't necessarily see the Met Council's role in other areas of transportation because they're directly exposed to transit, so just keep that in mind. They said that, if we were just talking about police on trains, that answer differently than the idea of a broader concept of safety. So a couple of nuances there. That graph there is a graph of traffic fatalities on the system. And you can see that during the pandemic, we had a substantial jump in traffic fatalities. And so this is a really high level issue for people that's being highlighted by the trend. It has gone down a little bit in the last year, but it's still significantly above past trends. And it certainly was not trending in the right direction over the last few years. So the next one that we heard, and how many of you see these out on the street today? Potholes filled with water. So system preservation is a top priority, but there's concern about maintaining the system as it is. This was actually a really interesting perspective that we heard. We heard from our partners, we have to maintain the system. We have to be good stewards of the system. And it was interesting when you talk to community members, they said, why do we want to maintain a system that doesn't work? So they're just looking at that language differently. I think what we would honestly say is we want to preserve our assets. We also want to modernize the system, and make it work better for people. So certainly preservation is important, but not necessarily preserving the system as it is. We have to be careful about saying that. Next theme that we got was that multimodal investments are important, but context and impact varies. So, it's not that transit's going to look the same everywhere in the region, or that, we're always going to get the same bang for the buck no matter where we invest. The photo there on the left is 50th in France in Edina. Obviously a very walkable area if you've ever been there. A couple of examples, Judy's probably familiar with one of these. Plymouth on Highway 55, they're proposing to build a new pedestrian tunnel under Highway 55 that'll connect both developments to the north side of the freeway and a redevelopment opportunity and a major regional trail to a transit center on the south side. So, different context, but still a very important infrastructure. That other one is actually, it's probably on the picture, it says Chaska, I believe. So the city of Chaska, that's Highway 212, it's a pedestrian bridge over the freeway. It's actually in a fairly low density area. So when we look at, is it serving a lot of people? Not necessarily, but keep in mind that there isn't another crossing of 212 for a mile on each side. And on the north side is a high school and on the south side is a middle school. So you can imagine that is a very important investment to them, even though it might not be serving the same type of needs as say 50th in France. So context is important. We also heard about equity. Not surprisingly, we heard that equity is a high priority. Sometimes the top priority, particularly amongst our community partners, but it is complex and it is context sensitive. I will say the majority of the questions we got are, what is the definition of equity that council is going to use? And I know there's drafts working through the process, but just a note for you all that that's a big question out there. We also heard, particularly from growing regions, that equity isn't the same out here as it might be in the core of the city, and also that they are experiencing the rapid growth in people of color that you see in the map here. That's a map of the growth rates for BIPOC percentages across the region. You can see the majority of the growth, not necessarily the concentration, but the growth has been in suburban communities. So it's a newer topic for them, I think, in a lot of cases, but it's definitely a growing topic.
Mr. Chair, before
Yes,
we get off of this slide, I would note that a big part of my district and a bake part of Councilmember Barber's district are cut off of the map. Catch Lakeville, and then everything south of there is not on the map. So that's one of the things that was brought up in the sessions, that when they make maps, big parts of the region aren't even on there. And the other thing that I think was fleshed out a little more on the equity thing in our sessions in both Scott County and Dakota County was that those counties, their growth has been post fair housing laws. So people are pretty much spread out throughout the whole area. If you don't have concentrations of poverty, you don't have concentrations of particular racial or ethnic groups, it's all through the community at all income levels. So they see the whole equity discussion a little differently than places that have that history and those challenges from the historical issues.
Yeah, Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to add on to that, if you go back to, for our new council members, we had a great listening session about comp plans and kind of the follow-up, interviewed communities, Bloomington versus Belle Plaine, and very different communities, both parts of the metropolitan region. And one of the things was both communities did address equity and had different topics and themes about it, but it was very different for the two different communities because of the populations that they were serving. They had just different needs fundamentally as communities, and it'd be something good if you get a chance to go back, maybe listen to that, because all of this planning that we're doing, because the thing that you'll hear me and Councilmember Wolf say often is we can't just build these plans to fit Minneapolis and St. Paul. It does have to be able to fit in Waconia and Belle Plaine and these other communities as well. And that applies to the transportation plan as well.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah, go ahead.
I will jump on that train as well. So yes, we have asked for the map to be whole so people don't feel left out, and that's out in the community too. And I know it's a big map, but I agree. And also, again, for those of us who've been around a while, or those of us who are new, it's really interesting, just a quick snapshot to look at where the biggest increases in BIPOC communities are moving and where the declines are. And especially if you're in housing or certainly in planning, you know, there will be times where you hear, and I represent a suburban edge and rural area, that I think there's this thought that suburban communities aren't becoming more diverse and they aren't working to, you know, diversify housing opportunities, affordable housing opportunities, and I guess invite everybody to come out and visit some of these areas because they're doing wonderful things. So sometimes you want to just dispel the myths. And there's also the same kinds of myths about the urban core, right? So it's good to be part of this group because we have people from all over this region, but every now and then somebody will raise their hand and go, just making a note so everybody understands the differences and the nuances that take place throughout the entire region.
Okay.
Right.
You know,
Go ahead, Todd.
I just want to say, one thing that I noticed, I've gotten to meet with a few of the mayors in my area, in my district, and there is a them versus us kind of like, because I kept hearing the core, and I'm hearing it now, and I know it's an easy way of identifying suburban versus more inner city areas, and but I think we, as much as possible, we have to push back on the kind of them versus us, because then someone has to be the bad guy and someone has to be the good guy. We're all good guys and we all want equity and fairness. And so, yeah, change is happening and it's different, and there's always a undercurrent of fear. But I'm just saying, let's look at it and try to take away as much as possible that kind of core versus outer, them versus us, and we're all trying to get to a place where we all can embrace whatever change is coming in a fair way, that everybody is still feel like they're tied into the fabric of this area.
It's fair. John?
Yeah, that's, Mr. Chair, members. I've just taken, participating in the Equity Advisory Committee as the co-chair. And our first meeting was looking at what is the definition. And we're getting, like you, getting all kinds of different variations, and we're gonna take it up again our next meeting, where we're working with Equity Task Force and others included here. But when you've done your listening sessions or met both in the community and as a group, I mean, we have like 21 members that are here looking to advise us or, you know, to participate, and we really want to give them something of value, not just have a nice dinner. So I just encourage you to engage as you can, and maybe have this presentation for that group as well, and you really make use of the skills that are there in front of us.
Definitely. Good. All right. Well, Dr. Carter, who I think I can call you that, correct? Yeah. He actually introduced a nice concept here, which is that there isn't actually agreement on every topic across the region. Climate change was brought up by some of our partners. It was completely not brought up by some of our partners. In fact, there was one partner that said, we generally agree with the ideas, we can't say climate change anywhere in our part of the region. That being said, I think there's different spectrums of how people view climate change. You know, I think on the extreme end, people want us to mitigate our contributions to climate change. You know, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, do as best we can. There's other parts of the region that say, you know, we're experiencing extreme weather. We need to make sure our infrastructure is resilient. That's our focus. You know, we need to make sure we're not getting extreme flooding that's shutting down roadways. And then other times we just hear that resiliency is the focus. There's no real connection to climate change. You know, they just want a resilient system. So we kind of said those are all related, just not in the same way. Basically hearing that climate change is not a consistent topic across the region. Some want us to go further and be really bold, be leaders, as I think our vision statement says. Some question the council's role on the topic. What is our actual role? What's our authority to tackle this topic? So just know that that sentiment is out there.
Interesting.
We also heard a lot from rural and suburban edge communities that they aren't being prioritized. You know, I think that's true of some of the statements you all made, especially though in the topic of addressing growth. You can see on this map the growth from 2010 to 2020 by community, that's net growth. We haven't, recognized the pandemic impacts that Todd Graham was just talking about, but you can see there's pretty broad growth across the region. No particular area stands out. Of course, Minneapolis and St. Paul, as being large cities, experience quite a bit of growth. But what we heard from rural communities and ex-urban communities, the fringe of the region, is that infrastructure investments are often lagging behind the growth. They're playing a very active role. And we heard, from our county partners, we heard we can't control growth. We just have to build roads to serve it. And we're not getting enough funding to meet the needs of the growth that is occurring. We did hear it's often difficult to see yourself in the plan. I addressed that, kind of around that idea of the maps, around the pictures that we use in our documents. I think that idea of making sure that we reflect the whole region is important to our partners. And we even heard from one county that the plan is an impediment to their work. Basically, it's just a way to get in the way of what they want to do. So there's some pretty extreme opinions.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
That's cool. And can you just expand a little more on the nature of the impediments that the plan causes in local communities?
Yeah, I think the primary thing there is that there's investments that want to be made in, say, expanding roadways for capacity to address congestion, and the TPP makes it perceived to make it difficult to do that. And that we're prioritizing, again, the urban core needs over some of the growing community needs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right. This is the last slide on themes, and it's just to capture a couple of other less common themes. I didn't want to talk about the investment themes we got. We got feedback on projects for days. Why don't you do this? Why don't you build this expanded roadway? We were really looking for, what's the point of doing that? What's the goal we're trying to achieve? So we're trying to tease a little bit that out. Why do they want us to expand that roadway? What are they trying to achieve? So we heard a lot about transit and highways in that sense. The middle bullets there were the interesting ones to me. We heard healthy economy. The economic development of the region was a little bit emphasized in our regional vision statements. But one of the interesting things we also heard was that, if you do all of your other transportation goals well, the economy will naturally be strong. And so making the economy a goal is really it's like an outcome of having your other goals achieved. So I thought that was a really interesting nuance to ask ourselves, is economic development the goal, or will it occur if we achieve things like equity, safety, access to places?
Yeah, that's good.
So I just wanted to pause here. I have a few more slides about next steps, but just, we've already kind of touched on these, but any other things that stood out to you, any surprises in the themes that you weren't expecting to see, or any themes that you want us to dig into more as we move forward on the TPP that can help you understand them?
Yeah, start here, John.
Mr. Chairman, when listening to the slides and seeing other presentations, I very seldom hear the word small business or engagement, and even corporate. I came from a more corporate background with the Latino Chamber to deal with small business. Very opinionated, they need the support. Even if you're just talking about economic development, where's their role in this? And they're growing across the region as well. So I'm just going to point that out. I think I pointed out at the last meeting. I'm not seeing that in what we're doing these days.
If I could just quickly respond, we did have a few chambers that we engaged with in the equity engagement contract. They did reach out to quite a few. I think a lot of these staff are probably just pretty busy and tapped out, but we'll certainly keep pushing that route.
I didn't get a call, but that's okay.
Deb?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the key thing that I heard, been to several of the listening sessions, was really a strong push on safety. And I think that, some of the comments that we're getting back obviously are reflective of transit safety, but there is a significant road safety problems. A lot of our spot mobility work has been to focus on some of those instances, but I know we all have roads in our district that are the ones that that the accidents happened on and things like that. And if there's a way to embed some of that language in even more, I think that, because it isn't just transit, it has to be transportation and transit. And I know we heard that at both Scott and Carver County, And I think that's just kind of critical that be built in there, because that really ties to some of the conversations we haven't tapped.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I'm representing District 12, and I've been on the job a month now, so I've talked to a few people and listened to a few things, and I think the theme 7, rural and suburban edge communities aren't being prioritized, would be more the theme that I'm hearing from people in District 12. There's areas that would like to grow, but there really isn't public transportation anywhere to get there. It's all cars. And then, how do we get more highway funds, but people don't want highways, they want bikeways. So the whole kind of rural suburban area in District 12, it seems like needs a new look. Somehow, and education on my part, I have a bunch of action items for me, but also outreach to the communities that I can do. So I'm gonna need some help on seeing, where the dollars have been spent in 12, how they're prioritized, where they're coming from, so I can educate myself and then do some more outreach to District 12 and my communities. But of all the transportation, that theme came out the most from all of the 6 people I've talked to, they all mentioned that.
Yeah, if I can say, Mr. Chair, we have historically, when we bring the regional solicitation forward, tried to give you all a district summary of what we're funding. We can see if we can pull together maybe a couple of years worth of look
That'd be
and
perfect.
send it to you all.
Yep, thank you.
That'd be helpful. Coming from a MnDOT perspective here for a minute, they have certain words that kind of fit on some of these themes. Like with corridors of commerce, it's regional balance. What is regional balance? Regional balance is, the balance of core versus deep rural. It's maybe for us, left and right, east and west, north and south. It isn't just about what's in the excerpt, it's literally the East Metro advocating for, and this is the political reality that we're facing, and we try to find balance, right? But ultimately, it's hard to put that in a plan. Yeah, Tiff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is it's a fiscally constrained plan. And so there is an expanded funding scenario in there, but it's if we get more money, this is all things we want to build. But it is balancing, not just, we all know our districts, and you'll get to learn your districts very well, and what the local needs are, but you have to look at, like you said, north, south, east, west, where one of the big studies we did was truck corridors, which was integral not only to some of the outer districts, but was to the core to get materials and supplies and things like that. And it's ultimately, this plan has to do all of that. It's unlikely we're going to make everyone happy. We've been doing this for several years, and we will, are really trying to proactively do this differently this time, where we're really engaging up front. Big thank you to doing the listening sessions out in the counties and different areas, because it matters. It just means that we want to come out and hear what people have to say, and we're doing it early in the process. But again, I'm sure we won't please everyone, but it is a balancing act, for sure.
Yeah, and following up on balancing act, when you talk about preservation versus other things that we'd like, this is kind of statewide, but it's true in the metro. Preservation, just pavements alone will eat you alive. There's nothing left. And so if you're a fiscally constrained plan, how do you do that? Because you'll never get there just with the things you need. Wendy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I had an aha moment when I was in the Scott County thing, and then it carried over into the Dakota County one. We talk about one of our goals is leveraging transportation spending to drive land use. But it occurred to me that in a lot of the collar counties, the county board's goal is just to accommodate what people tell them how they want to live. So development happens and they try to make the roads accommodate that development. But Hennepin and Ramsey counties tend to look at it more as, if we spend these transportation investments, like on light rail and such we can actually change how people want to live. So it's two very, very different cultures in the region that it just suddenly popped out to me really clearly how different those kind of worldviews are. The other thing that popped up recently for me was we keep talking about, we've got $2 billion of development along the Green Line extension, so forth. So we're gonna be spending over $2 billion. So far, we've gotten $2 billion in development. There'll be more. But I was at the State of the City for Lakeville recently, and in the last 3 years, from 2020 to 2022, the city of Lakeville has had over $1 billion of development with no investment from the council. All of the freeway interchanges and everything on 35 have been primarily paid for by the city and Dakota County with almost no federal or state involvement. And so when we talk about, while we're getting all this great development, we got to look at what's going on in the rest of the region that isn't getting any investment and have to pay for all of that highway infrastructure themselves, and be honest about it. We can't just tout the billions we got along light rail. What about the development in other places where we didn't participate?
Yeah, Tony Carter, then Judy.
Would love more conversation in that regard, and of course, so much of it has to do with density, developable land, but the perspectives as to where the investment goes, can be very different as well. I'd love us to have some additional information about that in terms of our history of funding, not just the Met Council, of course, but our state's history of funding, where those resources go, so that we can really be talking about that as we examine the future. Thanks for raising it.
Yeah, Judy.
And I would just, so again, for everybody in the room, it'll be a repeat for many of you, but these projects are decades in the making. And a lot can change, as we heard in our population and growth forecasts over even a decade. And so in that time too, our local partners, because everything starts with a local partner. If your local partners don't want it, your cities or your counties, it doesn't make it in the TPP. And so that takes a long time, because then you've got to start studies and funding, and we're doing it in the Highway 55 corridor right now, hoping one day to get BRT or ABRT. So, but I don't know if I'll be alive by the time it happens. My point though, however, is that we also then, through those long periods of time, our local partners change over. Like, there are new people that are elected and that have different perspectives, and the political climate changes and perspectives change. And that is very difficult for the council then to manage when in real time, something that's either trying to make its way to the TPP or is fully embedded in the TPP, or it's up and running, local partners change and we change, and yet we have to manage this thing and the projects that come behind it, and then in some cases own and operate it. So I just want everybody to be really aware of that, because we're going through that now and you'll learn more about that. But just because it makes it in the plan, it doesn't mean that it's smooth sailing at all. And we have examples of that. So all the new folks will learn about some of those things. It doesn't mean, there's just challenges and opportunities with everything that we do. But it can really turn on a dime pretty quickly when you've got years and years and years and invested 2 degrees, and this council then has to really understand, well, and especially with our Transitways advancement policy that we put in place, we can now do risk analysis and understand for our local partners, ourselves and everybody else, all the stakeholders, at which points do we need to mitigate the challenge, do we need to reassess our relationship with our partners and agreements, and how do we proceed? Because if we could do this all in 5 years, it'd be shiny, pretty and new, but a lot can change. Just look at logistics and inflation, what it's done to our projects in recent years, and interest rates when we go out to bond or that we get money in or whatever. So I just put that out there, that plans can be paper or digital, but people change over time too.
Sue, you're about to say something.
I am. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to piggyback on that and just do a shout out to Ramsey County. 2 weeks ago tonight, at a community input meeting in Maplewood, Ramsey County Commissioner Victoria Reinhardt got up and began the meeting by reading a letter from the county regarding the Purple Line, and it has caused a dramatic shift in the focus and a kind of a revisiting of what the options are. And I just can't say enough good about the wisdom with which Ramsey County has handled this. And it's gonna mean more work and more time for our Met Transit staff team that have been working on the Purple Line, but they're up for the process. Basically what the county proposed was taking a look at another option, which would be going along Maryland Avenue eastbound and then northbound on White Bear Avenue. It was something that had been brought up in previous meetings, but what it tells me is that Ramsey County was listening, was willing to rethink this, and again, I can't say enough good about how they handled it, and good things come from those strong partnerships, and I just wanted to brag about Ramsey County. Right.
And there's a meeting tomorrow, so.
Right.
And can I just note one thing? I think it's really important. You're starting to hear it in this conversation. If you didn't already know this, counties are a much bigger player in transportation than some of our other system plans.
Yeah.
So don't forget to meet with your county boards and your county staff as you're engaging. And I will just note, to your point, Member Carter, we do have summaries of our investments in the regional solicitation by county as well. We've actually looked at over the last, I want to say 4 cycles of the solicitation, probably close to $1 billion. And it's actually fairly balanced, how we've been investing across the different counties based on the percentage of the population. We can share some of that with you all. It doesn't include all investments, of course, it's just that limited pot, but just wanted to make that note. We tend to do a lot of analysis at the county level, just so you all know, so keep that in mind.
Deb.
And thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to add on to that because I agree 100%. It's a little different dialogue with transportation in general. I would highly recommend that you meet with the county engineer in your counties and have them show you the places that they're most concerned about. It's one of the first things I did and went on tours with both of them in Scott and Carver County. And so you can actually see it from that perspective of what they see as the problems and why it's a problem. So just, a good way to actually kind of get it the way of the land.
They know it all. Robert, then Peter.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just gonna say a bunch of stuff and hopefully there's something valuable within this. What really stood out to me, and the themes that weren't really that surprising but had to do with this, the geographic equity piece, right? And communities feeling like they're not getting their share or something. And I feel like that comment about the TPP is an impediment for counties. I think it's really interesting because in theory, this is their plan, right? You just said, the counties are big players. They're influencing this plan. So for me, it just sounds like there's a fundamental disconnect if the local communities feel like their own contribution to the regional transportation policy plan is creating an impediment. So, and I'm not suggesting anything there, but I feel like there's something there. And part of it, a lot of us here have served on TAP, a lot of us. And so I liked in your examples when you were going to the value or the vision, the policy, the action, what was it? Goals and objectives, policies and actions, and how there was a connection to the regional solicitation. And I feel like there's something useful there, and because our investments are fiscally constrained, so by definition, it's a zero-sum game, right? It's always winners and losers, and for those of you who've been on TAB, you've been through lots of, fun debates and discussions, even just trying to shift a little bit of the perspective. So the idea of, people throughput makes all the sense in the world, and is there some way of sort of leveling a playing field, So I like that. I like the direct connection of the transportation policy plan to the investment plan, to the regional solicitation. And again, I'm not suggesting anything specific. I apologize for that, but I feel like there's something there.
Yeah, and if I could, Mr. Chair and Councilmember Lilligren, and for everyone, I guess, one of the big projects you are all going to work on as a council is evaluation and potential overhaul of the regional solicitation, which will be kicking off later this year. That'll take the 2050 plan and put it into action in the regional solicitation. So expect that over the next 2 to 3 years. It's kind of starting up concurrent with the development of the policy plan, but the primary work will be in 2024 and 2025.
Interesting. Peter?
Yeah, we're busy.
Deb, your comment about the county engineer reminded me that 2 weeks ago we had a listening session in Hiniker County, which, by the way, Blaine is, when you're looking at the areas of growth, has gone from 50,000 at 2010 to now 70,000.
Fifth fastest growing city.
Fifth fastest growing, yeah, Highway 65 is a train wreck. It's a disaster.
It's horrible. It's been for years.
It has been for years, one of some of the most dangerous intersections
Yeah.
in the region. So there's that. But the county engineer was participating in the Hinoka County discussion, and that was in the morning. And then that evening, there was an Hinoka County local government meeting with probably 70 council members and mayors. And the county engineer spoke at that meeting and brought up that morning's meeting and encouraged people in that room to take a survey that is open right now, I think, or shortly, on this very topic. Is that accurate to say that the survey is coming down the pike?
Well, number one, it's news to me that they're sharing it. We did share a survey with all the partners we engaged with in case they weren't able to be at the meeting. So we gave the opportunity to provide feedback if you weren't able to be there in person. So that could be what they were referring to.
Well, if you get 70 responses from a
There's
number
stuff.
that's
Or
the reason why.
170.
And just to note, we did in that survey ask folks what representation they were. So like, were they from a city or county? To help us understand, if we need to kind of weight some of the responses we got. So hopefully that will come through. But we are going to bring that into the final report. What do we hear both at the session and through the surveys? But
Good intel, Councilmember, thank you. I know we're at time, and you may kind of finish off with some next steps.
Yeah, just one more slide. So as I said, the next step for us is to really start developing goals for the TPP. So I'm saying multi-factor process, and you'll like that quote there, if everything is important, nothing is important, which is actually a businessman quote. So we are going to start taking the different factors into place when we develop goals. We're going to take the council's vision statements into consideration, the themes that we're hearing from engagement and from the plan review that we just did. We're planning to develop some potential goal statements that we can then go through another process with prioritization. We're going to invite all the same stakeholders that we just engaged with to either meet with us again at a workshop or to take another survey to help us say, all right, we heard all these themes. Can you help us prioritize them? The point being that if we get another plan where someone says to me, I can do anything based on your plan, then it's not really a strategic plan for the region. And so we need to start identifying those common themes that everyone can agree are important and start, developing plans of action and strategies that get at those common themes. So that's the next phase. It's going to actually move relatively quickly. We're talking about draft goals by June for the transportation policy plan. And I just wanted to note that other box there too, ability to influence and implement. We can't just say goals that the council has no role in influencing. So we have to make sure we're taking into account what are our funding programs, what is our legal authority, what's our statute authority to actually do something about this issue, and make sure that we're not just, again, stating lofty goals that have no action behind them. That quote still resonates with me, strong on words, weak on implementation. So that's the next phase. I think We're primarily gonna be working through the Transportation Committee with content on the TPP moving forward. We'll certainly talk to Deb about anything she thinks would warrant coming to this group moving forward.
Cole, Pep.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Before we completely turn this over, as Cole mentioned, we do have a TPP advisory work group. It's a policy level work group. It's a mixture of people from TAB and from council. I chair it. There is 2 vacancies open. Currently, me and Councilor Pacheco are the representatives on it. In the spirit of geographic balance, we've been trying to do that with the city and county and everyone else, so I think we should do that with ourselves. So if there's anyone from the east and or north sides of the city who's interested in participating, just let me know.
When do you guys meet and where?
Typically Friday mornings.
I believe it is the second or third Friday mornings every month, virtually.
All right, so we're a little bit over. Thank you, Cole. I can see that you have been very robust in telling us where we are, but also the challenges that we're facing. And guess what? We all get to be involved. So great conversation.
Cole, flip two backup pictures, just a picture.
Unfortunately, I can't
It's
control
gone.
Oh, it's gone.
I have a hard copy here.
There was a beautiful picture of the Stone Arch Bridge that was lit up,
Yeah.
and that was Charlie Zelli's doing.
Yeah, wow.
And whenever you see that Stone Arch Bridge all lit up, remember Charlie did that.
It's a long story, and if somebody buys me a drink, I'll tell them. All right, with that, we're adjourned. Thanks, everybody.